Welcome back to the Evolving Warfighter. We continue this audiobook with Chapter 2 of clarifying the definition, techniques, and integration of self-development to enhance Army Officer Leader Development. Copyright 2016, Franklin C. Annis, ed.D. ISBN 9781521311615. The right of Franklin C. Annis to be identified as author of this work has been asserted by him in accordance with Sections 77 and 78 of the Copyright, Designs and Patents Act 1988. All rights reserved. The dissertation manuscript was edited for the purposes of producing an audiobook. Any in-text citation will not be read, but the reference to the various sources and authors will be displayed in the text on screen. Before we begin, we invite you to subscribe to the Evolving Warfighter for more videos on the topics of military self-development and military history. Chapter 2, Literature Review. While the nature of warfare is always evolving, the critical importance of Army leadership is disproportionately increasing as the U.S. military prepares for yet another force reduction. Whereas the U.S. Army, now over 238 years old, has developed theories and models to produce superior combat leaders, it still struggles to implement the needed self-development programs to optimize leaders. The purpose of this qualitative electronic Delphi study was to define the concept of self-development as it applies to Army Officer Leader development and to develop provisional training protocols or curricula to facilitate rapid acquisition of self-development skills among junior Army officers. Finding superior solutions in the integration of self-development techniques in training future Army officers requires a detailed understanding of the multiple theories, problems, and constraints surrounding this issue. First, the critical importance of self-development needs to be understood. Junior officers are currently facing complex problems and being asked to make critical decisions, with strategic consequences that in previous wars would have been made by superior officers. The current approaches to education, training, and operational experience are failing to optimize junior officers for the modern battlefield due to lack of self-development practices. Second, before self-development training can be reintegrated into Army leadership protocols, we need to understand the reasons why self-development practices have yet to be established among officers more than a decade after the implementation of the Army Leader Development Model. The Army has had a concept of self-development since at least the 1970s, yet still struggles to implement the practices. Historically, self-development practices within the Army have suffered from underemphasis and lack of supporting resources. Third, the current design and application of the Reserve Officer Training Corps program needs to be re-examined. The Reserve Officer Training Corps program serves as the basic education template of the majority of commissioned Army officers. Understanding and integrating the principles of the Army Leader Development Model within Reserve Officer Training Corps must be achieved to the fullest extent possible to ensure national security. Until this leader development model is fully supported to the extent possible, it will never function to produce adaptive and innovative junior officers. Finally, the concept of interdisciplinary studies needs to be understood in how this approach to education might assist Army officers in finding solutions to problems that lay within or between several different academic fields. This approach to academia may allow for the flexibility and adaptively to find creative solutions to complex problems. As the aims of Army self-development is to produce innovative and adaptive leaders, these goals logically call for academic approaches that move past the assumptions and restrictions of traditional academic disciplines. It is only after a careful examination of the above issues can attempts be made to adequately address the problems of this research. While it would be impossible to address all of the challenges facing the integration of self-development within the U.S. Army within a single study, it is important to possess an understanding of these complexities. Areas that study addressed will be highlighted within this review along with areas that will require additional research. Documentation. The literature search strategy used in this literature review included a review of both the military concepts of self-development along with the corresponding civilian theory of autonomous, self-directed learning. A thorough search was conducted of the major military academic databases to include the U.S. Army Combined Arms Research Library, the Defense Technical Information Center, the Center for Army Lessons Learned, the RAND Corporation, and the U.S. Army War College. Additionally, The Roadrunner search engine was used to identify civilian self-development resources held within the academic databases available to Northcentral University. Emphasis was placed on current publications dating from 2008 to present. When required, literature sources previous to 2008 were consulted to explore foundational research concerning these theories. Table 1 displays literary sources from 2008 to date. Table 2 presents sources of literature dating before 2008. Current Army leadership requirements. To understand the changing nature of warfare and the increasing demands on Army leaders, the prevailing concept of the levels of warfare need to be examined. First presented in 1982 in the Field Manual 100-5, Operations, the idea of tactical, operations, and strategic levels of war were created to help commanders visualize the battlefield. While the levels of war were intended to aid in the development and coordination of military operations, it is important to note that there are no definitive lines between these three levels of war. The strategic level. The strategic level of war is focused on supporting national security by achieving national strategic objectives. It is important to note that this level of war extends past the U.S. military and includes the President, National Security Staff, and the leaders of multiple government agencies. The area that the U.S. Army focuses on in this level of war is the achievement of theater strategic objectives set by the Secretary of Defense. Ultimately, this level of war is focused on winning the conflict and establishing peace in a manner that supports U.S. national policy. The operational level. The operational level of war focuses on the design, planning, and execution of the major operations and campaigns. This level of conflict is centered on commanders and their staff's ability to apply the operational art to developing creative plans to defeat enemy forces within the operational area. The operational level of war provides the link between the national security objectives and actions within the combat theater. The tactical level. The tactical level of war, the lowest level, refers primarily to the execution of battle or other assigned task. This level is typically focused on short-duration contact with the enemy. The intent of tactical level operations is to achieve assigned military objectives and support the larger military campaign concepts defined by the operational level. While these levels of war have never been exclusive to select ranks of army leaders, in traditional warfare these levels of war have been correlated with certain levels of command. Traditionally, strategic leadership was reserved to generals. Operational leadership was supplied by field-grade officers, and company-grade officers were concerned with tactical leadership. However, with the advancements in technology, warfare, and assigned missions, soldiers and junior leaders are increasingly making decisions with strategic-level impacts. Where previously junior leaders primarily operated in the tactical arena, modern warfare requires even junior officers to be mindful how their actions impact operational and strategic objectives. The increasing influence that even junior enlisted soldiers now hold on the battlefield caused U.S. Marine Corps General Charles C. Grulett to coin the term strategic corporal. As defined by Liddy, the term strategic corporal refers to the devolution of command responsibility to lower rank levels in an era of instant communications and pervasive media images. The creation of a strategic corporal requires additional training and development to build cultural sensitivity, media awareness, mediation skills, linguistic competence, foreign language, mastery of sophisticated weapons and sensors, and the capacity for small group operations within junior leaders. Additionally, leaders will have to be able to resolve crises via mediation, remain impartial, and understand the use or restraint concerning force. While this concept has placed pressure to revise the training of junior enlisted soldiers within the U.S. military, there seems to be a lack of a demand to develop strategic lieutenants capable of commanding these small group operations. If these skills have been identified as requirements of even lower enlisted soldiers, shouldn't mastery of these skills also be required of junior officers? Even with limited time and resources in training, there is no doubt that self-development programs could be established to assist in the continual development of the critical skills within soldiers that are associated with the strategic corporal concept. This issue will be further discussed in the Army Reserve Officer Training Corps Program section of this literature review. According to General Martin D. Dempsey, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, The most critical task for the survival of the profession of arms is the development of adaptive leaders. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have presented and continue to present the U.S. Army with incredibly adaptive, resourceful, and challenging adversaries. This has created a demand to produce Army leaders that can learn, adapt, and overcome faster than their enemy. The solution for defeating the enemy lies in the ability to overmatch their training with our training and with the development of our leaders. However, with the current operational tempo and the current approach to leader development, the Army is failing to provide leaders with the resources and development needed to optimize and outmatch our adversaries. The current decisions being made by junior officers are having strategic consequences for both the U.S. Army and the nation. The legitimacy and credibility of U.S. military operations are continually resting on the dozens of decisions that junior leaders are making on a daily basis. Not only do junior officers make critical choices on the battlefield, but they are also making choices and exercising power that in previous wars would have been exercised by senior commanders with years of experience. The ability to self-develop could be the missing key to improving the performance of junior leaders and compensate for lack of years of additional institutional training and experience. The leader's skills and attributes required to operate effectively on the modern battlefield are distinctly different from those required in past wars. It is imperative that leader development grows our junior officer and prepare them to make these decisions in the absence of years of experiences that would have been afforded senior officers in previous wars. It is likely that the U.S. Army will continue to face more uncertain, complex, and competitive as hybrid threats challenge the U.S. Army across the full spectrum of operations. The enemy is increasingly trying to draw the U.S. military into protracted and intense conflicts utilizing complex terrain to exhaust the U.S. resolve. As the size of the U.S. Army contracts, the decentralized capabilities and distributed operations of smaller operational forces are presenting a genuinely challenging leadership environments. The current focus of Army leader development will remain vested in the fundamentals of move, shoot, and communicate, and its effectiveness will still be assessed against tasks, conditions, and standards. However, changes in the system are required to produce inquisitive, creative, and adaptable leaders and reward them for this behavior. These changes in thought processes will require officers to become at least multidisciplinary if not interdisciplinary scholars. Increasingly, Army officers will have to address complex problems that go beyond traditional lines of scholarship. Critical thinking has become the essential for successful Army leaders to overcome the complexity of the modern battlefield. History can tell us that the U.S. Army is unlikely to be optimally designed for the next threat. It will not have the perfectly designed equipment to address a yet unknown threat. Another lesson learned from history is that higher headquarters will need time to adapt to this unknown threat and will delay in providing guidance to lower Army leaders. Therefore, the strongest military response to any new threat is quality leadership. For this reason, leader development has become job number one. Cultural awareness has also come to the forefront of need in Army leader development. Continued development in Army junior leaders to understand civil-military interactions is critical to success. Positive interactions will only occur if there is an understanding and respect for the cultures of the areas in which the Army operates. The traits of communication and interpersonal tact are among the 17 Army leadership dimensions currently found in the Army Leadership Field Manual. However, the difficulty of communicating in foreign languages and dealing with peoples of other cultures demand emphasis within leader development programs. One of the most critical tasks to improve Army officer leader development is to rebalance officer leader development by fully applying the Army leader development model. Operational experience, education/training, and self-development are required to produce quality adaptive Army leaders throughout their careers. While not all concepts within the system could be utilized within Reserve Officer Training Corps, the domain of self-development, which could be adapted into Reserve Officer Training Corps, is largely absent. Not a single hour of the 240 hours curriculum of Reserve Officer Training Corps classroom instruction was dedicated to the topic of self-development in 2012. In 2014, a single one-hour course on self-development was added to the curriculum. Thus, upon commissioning Reserve Officer Training Corps graduates are already more unbalanced than necessary. This is creating a negative start to their careers as Army leaders. If the full benefit of creating self-learning officers is to be reaped, then a process of self-development should be implemented as early in an officer's career as possible. The Reserve Officer Training Corps program needs to increase efforts to develop officers capable of the self-development, autonomous learning, required to adapt and overcome the complexities of modern combat. On a positive note, the U.S. Army is currently an army that wants a challenge. Almost a decade of conflict has created battle-hardened soldiers that want to be challenged during training to the same extent they were tested on the battlefield. This creates an environment in which the Army is more supportive of training and programs, including educational programs, which would challenge and develop its soldiers and future leaders. Why self-development is critical. The challenges that the U.S. Army faces are complex and ever-changing. With incredibly diverse missions ranging from traditional conflicts, counterinsurgency operations, nation-building, to humanitarian aid, the demands on Army leadership are immense. Army leaders are increasingly being asked to conduct operations as part of an interagency, joint, or multinational coalition force. With centralized planning but decentralized execution, junior officers are facing leadership challenges far greater than those of their rank and experience would have met in the past. With the speed and reach of modern media, even small errors that would have been overlooked in previous wars now have the potential to have significant negative impacts on national security objectives. Facing enemy forces with low tactical defeat thresholds but high strategic threat thresholds, Army leaders are increasingly challenged to respond with the right amount of violence to balance tactical and strategic objectives. This forces Army leaders to abandon the mission of finding, fixing, and destroying the enemy in limited warfare to selecting only the force needed or even withholding strength to ensure strategic objectives are not compromised. The need to rebalance the Army leader development to instill the adaptability within Army leaders has been placed as the most critical challenge facing the U.S. Army to ensure the survival of the profession of arms. Self-development can provide officers the ability to acquire the skills, knowledge, and behaviors required to be successful in whatever mission and/or operational environment in which they are placed. The demands on Army leader development have only increased as the Long War, the formal name for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, presented the Army with an incredibly adaptive and resourceful adversary. The use of Army self-development may be the key to maintaining the ability to outthink and evolve faster than the enemy. For these reasons, self-development is a critical component to Army leader development. The need for self-development becomes more evident when evaluating the course length and time allowed to train Army officers. The majority of Army officers complete 240 hours of Reserve Officer Training Corps curriculum before being commissioned. Following commissioning, an officer proceeds through the Basic Officer Leadership course. These courses are branch, specialty, specific and vary in length from 11 to 41 weeks. These courses provide approximately 680 to 1880 total hours of instruction to officers before they become deployable. Given that officers are required to be able to execute combat tasks common to all soldiers, much of this training time is not dedicated to leadership training. The demands of training in the Army warrior tasks, such as learning how to fire various weapons or knowing how to respond to events like chemical attacks, can be significant. During basic combat training, the Army utilizes 605 hours to train enlisted soldiers on the Army warrior tasks. The administration requirements of in- and out processing further reduce training time by consuming significant amounts of time. Technical training for each branch further consumes training time while not exercising leadership skills. As a result, the amount of actual leader development that is provided to newly commissioned officers in institutional training is far less than what may have been initially intended. As technical and tactical training requirements continue to increase in modern warfare and course lengths remaining static, technical instruction continues to erode training time originally designed for leader development. The currently allotted training time seems to be far less than what would be needed to develop leaders to overcome an adaptive adversary without the need for self-development. While self-development is usually thought of as an individual's task, it has larger cultural ramifications for the entire Army. By placing emphasis on learning, responsibility to expand one's abilities, and openness to new ideas, a learning culture is established which extends beyond individual leaders. The act of constant self-development builds a culture of continuous organizational improvement, which is key to improving performance and maintaining adaptability to changing environments. Like many other individual traits demonstrated by leaders, the practice of self-development among leaders sets the example for junior soldiers on their development of leadership skills also to engage in this activity. Self-development within an Army context can expand an individual's knowledge, bring increased self-awareness, and expand understanding of factors influencing the current operational environment. These three skills are critical for successful leadership on the modern battlefield. Through self-development, a leader can examine and improve his/her knowledge base on the assigned tasks and the missions. While this is always a useful skill, it is particularly useful on the modern battlefield where officers are continually asked to conduct missions, like community rebuilding, that are not traditional to the profession of arms. Army officers have stepped in and are now de facto mayors, city engineers, and national building authorities in the areas of conflict. With atypical assignments becoming more common on the battlefield, Army leaders are continually facing the challenge of addressing situations to which they have no formalized training or education. Self-directed learning is often the only way of gathering the information required to ensure mission success. During high-stress environments typical of military operations, the increased self-awareness created through self-development can significantly enhance performance of leaders. Officers can come to a better understanding of how and why they are responding to particular situations in the manner that they do. Through the process of self-development, Army leaders can improve their physiological resiliency to stressful environments and enhance the choices and quality of leadership that they are providing under operational conditions. Finally, through the process of self-development, leaders can come to a better understanding of their operational environment and identify previously unknown factors that are influencing the current situation. This is particularly true when operating in foreign cultures. A better understanding of the culture, politics, history, and religion of the area of operations can have significant impacts on a leader's ability to accomplish their mission effectively. Ultimately, self-development is critical for the survival of the U.S. Army because it bridges the gap between what has been taught and what is needed to be learned for optimal performance in a particular environment. It is the active process of creating self-directed learners who can identify and correct shortcomings in knowledge and skills. Self-development is the backbone for adaptively and innovation required for domination of the modern battlefield regardless of how the mission or operational environment evolves. Self-development theories. The U.S. Army operates in complex and diverse environments. The significance of success and failure are often measured in human life. Charged with maintaining national security, the unique and intense demands of the profession of arms at times create conflicts in the theories and application of leader development in comparison to the civilian sector. In this section, the current state of Army self-development theory will be discussed, followed by an exploration of areas of conflicts in definitions between Army and civilian self-development theories. Army self-development. The original Army leader development model is composed of three pillars. While the pillars of institutional training and education and operational assignments have been well defined and implemented into the leader development doctrine of the U.S. Army, self-development has largely been overlooked and underemphasized. Army Regulation 600-100 formally defines the concept of Army self-development as initiatives focus on maximizing leader strengths, reducing weaknesses, and achieving individual leader development goals. IT should stretch and broaden the individual beyond the job or training. Self-development, a critical component for lifelong synthesis of the knowledge, skills, and experiences is required within Army leader development. When an updated Department of the Army pamphlet 350-58 was published on March 8, 2013, the Army leader development model was revised. The three pillars of leader development were redefined as training, education, and experience. The original pillars of operational experience, institutional learning, and self-development were converted into domains. Each of the domains is now believed to influence the three redefined pillars of Army leader development. The revision of the Department of the Army pamphlet 350-58 also included the following revised definition of self-development. A planned, dimension-based, progressive, and sequential process the individual leader uses to improve performance and achieve development goals. Self-development is a continuous process that takes place during institutional training and education and operational assignments. It is a joint effort that involves the leaders and the commander or supervisor. Self-development actions are structured to meet specific individual needs and goals. It starts with an assessment of leadership skills, knowledge, and potential. A counseling and feedback session follows each assessment. During the counseling sessions, commanders or supervisors assist the individual to identify strengths, weaknesses, and developmental needs. Additionally, they discuss causes for strengths and weaknesses, and courses of action to improve performance. This definition of self-development places the process within a community context unseen in previous Army definitions of this term. While the manual does not go on to further explain the methods and techniques of self-development, it places the responsibility for self-development on both the individual and his/her supervisor. In light of this new definition, the term of self in self-development can be seen to have shifted from the individual responsible for the development to the focus of the development. While the new manual redefines self-development into a communal context, the lack of further context on how individuals and leaders are to design, conduct, and assess self-development still leaves a significant weakness in applying this critical domain. Given the operational needs of the long war, Army leaders have operated in an environment that has not placed emphasis on the importance of leader development. While the leadership demands of the long war have taught the importance of adaptive and innovative leaders, the operational requirements have reduced the focus to develop such leaders. There is an immediate need to rebalance all three domains, including self-development, of the Army leader development model to address the Army leadership needs of the future. Simply put, developing these adaptive leaders is the #1 imperative for the continued health of our profession of arms. Therefore, to meet the challenges of the modern battlefield, leader development is to be the primary emphasis of the Army and be provided support at all levels. The process of self-development aids Army leaders by allowing them to identify personnel strengths and shortcomings. Only after these leadership strengths and weaknesses have been identified is it possible to develop plans and take actions to either actively exploit the strengths and/or correct weaknesses within an individual's leadership abilities. Given the importance of the mission that Army leaders hold and the consequences for not performing to the highest possible standards, it is an obligation of all Army leaders to seek continually to develop and improve their leadership abilities. Even junior Army leaders that fail to live to their highest leadership capabilities are likely to encounter substantial consequences for their failures. These consequences can include the loss of life and/or strategic-level consequences that are greater than leaders would have faced in previous wars. Therefore, the Army can no longer afford to ignore this crucial domain of self-development in leader development. Probably the largest barrier to conducting self-development in the Army is a lack of understanding of self-development techniques. Thomas recommends several self-development techniques that could be easily incorporated into an undergraduate academic program. Thomas suggests examining leadership models and theories, conducting 360-degree assessments, creating goals, revising leadership, leader, and command philosophies, conducting book reviews, mentoring, and writing leader journals, as techniques of self-development. Ponton, Derek, and Carr also recommended logging or journaling as a technique for self-development. Chandra Schulte suggested that the technique of journaling could be easily integrated into Reserve Officer Training Corps curriculum. Listing self-development techniques does assist in its implementation, but a listing of specific techniques to improve select leader dimensions might be the optimal solution. Not only do leaders need to have methods of self-development available to them, they must also understand what techniques can improve in their specific areas of weakness. The term self in self-development might be a cause for confusion. While the individual or self must provide the motivation to engage in self-development, the process is in no way isolated to the individual. The most effective self-development programs are supported and assisted by subordinates, peers, and supervisors alike. This concept has now been reinforced with the revision of the definition of self-development in the Department of the Army pamphlet 350-58 that describes this process as one involving both the individual leader and his/her supervisor. Prior to this newly redefined definition, perceptions of this term by junior leaders were that they were wholly responsible for identifying goals and selecting methods without the need to consult any support. Ultimately, the goal in creating leaders that conduct self-development is to build skill sets in potential leaders where leaders choose learning over non-learning activities. Assuming that cadets are regularly exposed to self-development techniques supported by supervisors during their undergraduate program, it would be likely that they would continue these practices after commissioning. By developing leaders to continually seek learning opportunities, a culture of continued development and improvement can be established. Out of this learning culture, it is likely the leaders that are faced with complex problems will be able to identify their educational or personal weaknesses and take actions to select and conduct appropriate self-development to strengthen these areas. Motivation and self-development. In the civilian community, the most commonly accepted definition of self-development is Noel's concept of self-directed learning. Self-directed learning is 1. A process in which individuals take the initiative, 2. With or without the help of others, 3. In diagnosing their learning needs, 4. Formulating learning goals, 5. Identifying human and material resources for learning, 6. Choosing and implementing appropriate learning strategies, and 7. Evaluating learning outcomes. This definition can be subdivided into 7 distinctive features. First, the individual decides that learning is required and takes action to correct his/her learning deficit. Second, while an individual may seek additional outside support for self-development activities, this support is not required. Third, an individual assesses and determines his/her learning desires or shortfalls. Fourth, learning objectives are established to correct deficits. Fifth, the resources required for correcting the deficiencies are identified. These resources can include both data and instructor support. Sixth, learning strategies are selected which best serves the individual. And finally, the result of the self-development program is examined to determine if the education goals were reached or if deficiencies still exist. While the Army concepts of self-development would agree with the majority of these features, the first requirement of an individual taking the initiative, sometimes stated as being intrinsically motivated, may at times conflict with Army self-development concepts. The obligation for officers to conduct self-development causes many of the Army self-development theories to come into conflict with civilian theories. While all leaders do have some form of motivation to be effective, mismatching the motivation to succeed with poor instructional practices has unfortunately resulted in poor results. Leaders with weaker motivation are unlikely to find success through the use of distance learning like CD-ROMs in comparison to other more engaging techniques. Given that motivation plays a key role in the success of self-development, many civilian theorists would assert that self-development should be an entirely voluntary process. The Army often states the practice of self-development as an obligation of Army leaders. Self-development is continuous and must be pursued during both institutional and operational assignments. Mensch and Prescott stressed the need for self-development requirement in Reserve Officer Training Corps cadets. The instructors must have students, cadets, who are dedicated, lifelong learners. This may be the only way to produce quality leadership for the military of the future. It is simply not feasible for even the most efficient Reserve Officer Training Corps organization to offer instruction needed to lead effectively in today's operational environment without the element of autonomous learning, self-development, added to the leader development equation. Numerous other military sources list self-development as an obligation. The Army Leadership Manual states, Army leaders must invest more time on self-study and self-development than before. In no other profession is the cost of being unprepared as unforgiving, often resulting in mission failure and unnecessary casualties. The emphasis that the concept of self-development received as a pillar of leader development in the Army leader development model demonstrates its critical nature to Army leader development. The Army Corps leader competency of development includes the ability to prepare self-development. Therefore, both Army Reserve Officer Training Corps cadets and officers are assessed on their ability to execute self-development. Through the application of formal assessments and terms like obligation attached to self-development definitions, it is hard to perceive self-development in Army leaders as truly and entirely voluntary, intrinsically driven. On further examination, a method was revealed that might be a means of maintaining high levels of motivation in Army leaders even if self-development is stated as an obligation. Individuals that engage in and become proficient in self-development are more likely to continue self-development processes. Menschendra Schulte suggested the implementation of a screening process for Reserve Officer Training Corps cadets that would select those that are already established themselves as autonomous learners. Having been successful self-developers outside the military context, it is likely these individuals would voluntarily continue their self-development. As a result, the Army could fulfill its obligation to have self-developing leaders by selecting known volunteers of self-development techniques. While the Army often lacks the ability to be too selective in recruitment activities due to the demands of ongoing wars, it is likely with the long war coming to an end that self-development practices could be used as a selection criterion for future Army officers. While scholars agree that motivation is required for successful self-development, how motivation factors are defined and how these components interact in service to self-development are yet to be fully understood. The investigation into the level, amount, and orientation, type, of motivation required to be successful in self-development that was started by the noted scholar Deci in the 1970s continues to this day. At the heart of these inquiries are the differences between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic drives are something that brings personal satisfaction or enjoyment. Extrinsic motivation leads to some distinguishable outcomes, such as a job promotion. Intrinsic motivation is viewed as the superior of the two types of motivation that causes an individual to become the most engaged in the targeted activity. The initial studies on the interaction between these two types of motivation indicated that extrinsic reward might negatively impact intrinsic drives. Deci found that paying or extrinsically rewarding students that enjoyed and were intrinsically motivated while completing puzzles during their free time became less likely to complete puzzles when they were not extrinsically rewarded. Later studies questioned the design of Deci's original study. Continued investigation led to the discovery of applications of extrinsic rewards that could be used to support intrinsic motivation. One method of extrinsic support to intrinsic drives being rewarding task mastery instead of time spent on the task. The creation of these theories, that allows for extrinsic support for intrinsic motivation that has led to a gray area in most organizations in the use of self-development. Organizations are continually blurring the application of extrinsic reward to encourage intrinsically driven self-development into non-voluntary activities. To complicate matters further, Rice suggested that the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivations may not exist. He suggested that all motivation is intrinsic, and the intrinsic/extrinsic definitions of motivation were created by the perception of dualism between the mind and body. He also points out the dangers in utilizing an intrinsic/extrinsic approach to education in which educators give up on students because they fear the use of extrinsic reward would destroy intrinsic drives. The myth that all students are intrinsically motivated to learn the various subjects required to complete their education contradicts the reality of the classroom. Therefore, even framing the definitions of motivation in this way may lead to poor instructional practices. It is evident that there is a continued need to examine the influence on motivation on self-development. Through a better understanding of how motivation can be defined and how it impacts self-development, techniques could be developed to increase the likelihood and effectiveness of self-development programs. Additionally, the influence of high-stress environments on motivation also needs to be examined. The operational environment and mission of the U.S. Armed Forces may require a different approach to motivation and self-development than less stressful and consequential professions. In the end, with the high costs of failure facing an adaptive enemy, the U.S. Army cannot make self-development an option among its leaders. Self-development decades later. May 25, 2001, under the direction of Army Chief of Staff, General Eric K. Shinseki, the U.S. Army Training and Leader Development Panel published a report on the future of Army leader development. This report described how self-development would function as a bridging device between the leader development that occurred between operational experiences and institutional training. It was asserted that self-development would serve to create self-awareness, adaptability, and lifelong learning within Army leaders. These characteristics are essential to a transformational fighting force that faced rapid changes in doctrine, technologies, and approaches to warfighting. While the Army continues to stress the importance of self-development and has done so for more than 35 years, the concept of self-development and the assertions of what self-development accomplishes remain in question. This section will examine likely barriers that have prevented self-development to be fully utilized within the Army Officer Corps. These barriers include the perceived value of self-development, lack of a concept of self-development, and the lack of a self-development assessment. Lack of perceived value. The lack of time and resources dedicated to self-development within the military might be caused by the misunderstanding of its value. McGuire conducted a study on 3 populations of officers: brigade commanders, general officers, and senior general officers. Each group was to define and rate the importance of leader development experiences, including operational assignments, institutional education, mentorship, other developmental experiences, and self-development. It came as no surprise that operational assignments were rated the most critical leader development experience for all 3 groups. However, the assessment of self-development was surprising. The brigade commanders, direct leaders, ranked self-development as the lowest importance of all leader development experiences. General officers, transitioning to strategic leaders, ranked self-development 4th in significance. Finally, and most surprisingly, the senior general officers, strategic leaders, ranked self-development as the 2nd most essential leader development experience. Several reasons for the possible variance in ratings between these groups were suggested. Like other scholars, McGuire indicate that the high operational tempo of direct leaders might be hampering their ability to find the time to conduct self-development. Interestingly, McGuire suggests that the senior general officers that ranked self-development highly were likely engaging in self-development throughout their careers. It may be that self-development increases in importance at the strategic leadership levels, and those that were proficient in this type of behavior advanced to the highest positions of leadership. Lack of a concept of self-development. The need for self-development has grown within the Army as it faces more complex and dynamic environments. Just 20 years ago, the major threat that faced the U.S. Army was the Soviet Union. When faced with this massive opponent who was not known for its adaptability or innovation, self-development activities from reading to graduate degrees were viewed as a bonus but not requirements among junior officers. Now that the Army is facing threats from adaptive and resourceful adversaries, the ability to operate in ambiguous, complex, and uncertain environments is critical to the success of Army leaders. The importance of self-development is shifted from an optional bonus to an essential requirement for success. Self-development is now being called upon to create the adaptive and innovative leaders that can outthink and outmaneuver the enemy while supporting the larger strategic goals within the area of operations. The ultimate goal of Army self-development is to create an independent study program that assists individuals to meet specific goals established by the Army. The advantage to constructing such courses is that the Army in turn benefits from leaders that have acquired the skills, knowledge, and behaviors that are required to complete the organization's mission. This produces a cycle that improves the Army's capabilities by building upon the abilities of its leaders. The active participation in self-development also demonstrates a degree of organizational commitment in the attempt to improve performance not seen in those who do not participate in self-development. Unfortunately, the link between the intended purpose and the application of self-development has not filtered down to junior leaders. As explained by Beagle, the general disunity in understanding self-development as it relates to the future needs of the Army make it difficult for leaders and soldiers to define, apply and benefit from the concept. Without a clear understanding, it is impossible to construct self-development programs that meet the intended goals. This has resulted in self-development being reduced to a list of online classes, correspondence courses, and advanced civilian degrees that may or may not support the needs of the Army and individual leaders. The concept of self-development may also suffer from false or misassumptions about the results of self-development. The Army Training and Leader Development Panel presents the assumption that self-development can increase a leader's capacity to become self-aware, adaptive, and inspire lifelong learning. Unfortunately, This document does not provide guidance on how or what self-development techniques might accomplish these goals. As a result, senior leaders may be less likely to support self-development practices because the results of some self-development techniques may not be delivering the results promised by the Army Training and Leader Development Panel report. The Army Handbook for Self-Development, intended for junior soldiers, did provide a standardized method for establishing self-develop goals or milestones. Soldiers were asked to assess proposed self-development goals utilizing 7 criteria: specific and measurable, meaningful, challenging, time-based, flexible, realistic, and cost-effective. While the intent of providing a standardized means of a self-development program was accomplished, those conducting the evaluations, junior soldiers, lacked significant experience in the proposed methods to make reliable judgments. This handbook failed to present diverse options or approaches in self-development and failed to yield the data required to adequately utilize the proposed assessment matrix. While self-awareness, adaptability, and lifelong learning might be byproducts of self-development, they are likely second-level effects of leaders coming to a greater understanding of how they best acquire knowledge through self-development. After conducting several self-development practices, the leaders come to a greater understanding of what types of resources and learning materials would best assist them when facing a skill, knowledge, or behavior shortfall on a given mission. The solutions to the problem of misconceptions about the promise of self-development might be solved through a listing of self-development technique aimed at specific goals. If the Army provided a list of specific methods or techniques to improve the various Army leader dimensions, both individual and senior leaders might benefit in achieving the results desired through self-development programs. Lack of a self-development assessment. The assessment of self-development presents significant challenges within the U.S. Army. Unlike other skills like technical or tactical competence, self-development is highly subjective and difficult to assess. The advancements in leader development made from the baseline to post-self-development activities are often extremely difficult to measure, especially for those with no formal instruction on educational assessments. As a result, the assessment of self-development often shifts to the amount of time an individual's participation in self-development practices and not the actual progress made via self-development. This approach that considers any officer that engages in reading, correspondence courses, or graduate education programs to be good self-developers ignores the fact that time spent in self-development programs does not always directly correlate with increases in leadership abilities. A more effective way to measure the impact of self-development programs would be to directly measure enhancement in self-development skills, because self-development is aimed at improving skill sets in the cognitive, evaluative, self-confidence domains. These are the skills that should be measured to verify progress in self-development. This measurement strategy places greater demands on individual and leaders to seek out and understand the self-development concepts and evaluation methods that are not being readily supplied to them by the Army. Currently, there is a distinct lack of tools, support, and emphasis on self-development to effectively develop lifelong learners in the U.S. Army. This is possibly due to the fact the current officer evaluation system does not allow for assessment of self-development. Even with researchers such as Antonopoulos, Maurer, Pierce, Shaw, Van Velser and Macaulay demonstrating the positive correlation between self-development activities and critical leadership skills, the Army still has yet to ensure universal participation in these activities by Army leaders. These researchers demonstrated that self-development could increase confidence, problem-solving abilities, and acquisition of specialty skills required to operation in a complex operational environment. The lack of focus and participation on self-development is having a significant impact on Army leaders, as it is impossible to achieve optimum potential without the active component of self-development. At the current time, officers are not specifically assessed on self-development in their officer evaluation report. Army Regulation 623-3 asserts that officer evaluation reports focus on leader performance and not individual development. The current officer evaluation report, recorded on the Department of the Army Form 67-9 dated October 2011, has no specific block or area on this form that requires the recording or assessment of self-development practices. Officer evaluation reports are the primary means of assessing an officer's performance and determining their next duty assignment. The lack of a self-development assessment within this form indicates that officers are neither formally rewarded nor punished for the participation or lack thereof in self-development activities. While there are required institutional training and operational experience requirements for advancements in rank and position, there are no mandatory requirements to participate in self-development activities. Each branch of the officer corps has a published Department of the Army pamphlet that clearly defines the required institutional training and operational assignments for career progression. With the myriad of tasks assigned to Army leaders and a lack of an assessment device, self-development further loses importance and is often just ignored to focus on tasks with more perceived value. Thus, self-development falls victim to the old military adage, trust but verify. While self-development is stated as a requirement in military manuals, until an assessment is put into place, there is no way to check if this process is actually being carried out by Army leaders. Lack of a single self-development resource center. While the Army has numerous resource centers and collection sites for specific topics, it does not have a unified site for self-development. Currently, the bulk of the latest approaches and techniques for self-development reside on various military academic sites including the Combined Arms Research Library, Defense Technical Information Center, and Army War College. These sources are not typically explored by junior officers. With the concepts and intent of self-development resting in Army field manuals and the reports of U.S. Army training and leader development panels, it should be no surprise that this information is not trickling down to junior leaders. Doughty suggested the creation of a self-development resource center that could be created on the already established My Leader Development page hosted by the Center of Army Leadership. This self-development page would take on a role similar to the Army Center for Lessons Learned by presenting the most current and effective approaches utilized by subordinates, peers, and superiors. This page could display the definition and purpose of self-development along with various self-development approaches and programs. It also has the advantage of being easy to locate, being already linked within the Army Knowledge Online web page. Not only would this present the knowledge in a unified fashion to junior officers, but it would also serve to reinforce the learning organization culture the Army seeks to establish. Army Reserve Officer Training Corps. The National Defense Act of 1916 created the Army Reserve Officer Training Program as we understand it today. The concept behind this act was to allow college-educated citizens to receive military instruction and serve as officers in the three components, Regular Army, Army National Guard, and Army Reserves, of the U.S. Army. While the tradition of offering military training in civilian learning institutions dates back to as early as 1819, the National Defense Act of 1916 formed Reserve Officer Training Corps into a regulated federally controlled entity. The Army Reserve Officer Training Corps builds broad-based officers that are not only quality leaders but also bring the strengths and qualities of their diverse communities into the Army. As of 2013, there are 273 Army Reserve Officer Training Corps programs with over 600 participating colleges and universities. Army Reserve Officer Training Corps graduates diversify the Army Officer Corps in every social aspect from class to ethnicity. The strength of the U.S. military, including the Officer Corps, has always been its diversity and correlation with the heterogeneity of America. For this reason, the Army Reserve Officer Training Corps program exists in various types of colleges and universities from elite private Ivy League to public open enrollment institutions to ensure a diverse recruitment. Army Reserve Officer Training Corps produces more officers than any other officer producing program in the United States, to include the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and the various Army officer candidate schools. Well over 500,000 officers have graduated and received their commission through the Army Reserve Officer Training Corps program. In 2013, 78% of officers commissioned through the Reserve Officer Training Corps program. Chandra Schulter suggested that Reserve Officer Training Corps be renamed Reserve Officer Development Corps, given that the leader development conducted by Reserve Officer Training Corps far exceeds the definition of training. It is unlikely that the U.S. Army would abandon a close to 100-year-old tradition and brand name. However, Mentioned Schulter's suggestion does emphasize the requirement to focus on leader development to meet the leadership challenges of the modern battlefield, with the increasing leadership demands on junior Army leaders in modern operational areas. A close examination of the Reserve Officer Training Corps program is needed to ensure this program is effectively developing leaders. Unfortunately, in the last century, Reserve Officer Training Corps has largely failed to keep pace with the leadership changes caused by modern technology and the speed of the modern battlefield. Major General Daniel Wallace, former commanding general of the U.S. Army Cadet Command, recently noted that Reserve Officer Training Corps instruction has remained largely unchanged from what he observed 30 years ago. To complicate matters further, the Reserve Officer Training Corps program still struggles to be fully integrated into the academic communities. Reserve Officer Training Corps is still being perceived as something in addition to the scholarly community and not a component of an educational program. While there is a distinct leader development concept within the design of Reserve Officer Training Corps, the majority of a cadet's academic studies are being influenced by academic development theories of individual institutions. These institutions may or may not support the needed leader development of cadets. One significant barrier to implementing support for self-development within Reserve Officer Training Corps is the false assumption of undergraduate education. It is assumed that individuals that are capable of progressing academically through their undergraduate studies will also acquire the skills of self-development. However, it is impossible to correlate the connection of academic grade point average with the process of self-development and abilities for self-directed learning. Like military institutional training, undergraduate courses focus more on accomplishing assigned objectives and often do not provide its students with the tools needed for successful self-development. The lack of a unified academic development approach to education brings attention back to the skills associated with the concept of a strategic corporal. To commission out of the Reserve Officer Training Corps program, cadets must finish the academic degree requirements, undergraduate or higher, of their enrolled institution. While every college or university has a list of general academic requirements, these requirements may or may not run parallel with the needed skills associated with the strategic corporal concepts. As previously mentioned, these critical areas include cultural sensitivity, media awareness, mediation skills, linguistic competence, foreign language, mastery of sophisticated weapons and sensors, and the capacity for small group operations. While it is obvious that not all of these components could be learned within a civilian academic environment, the Army should take advantage of the areas that could be reinforced within college classrooms. These areas include a greater focus on cultural diversity, including cultural exchange programs, mediation skills, and instruction in foreign languages. Improving junior leader battlefield performance could start with aiding cadets to select these types of study experiences when they are presented several courses that could fulfill the academic requirements of their institutions. Additionally, with the growing importance of cultural awareness and foreign language skills, the Army needs to continue to offer opportunities to gain these skills early in a leader's career. Improving the possibilities of these experiences was a recommendation of the Junior Officer Leader Development Research Bulk I, Reserve Officer Training Corps report. The Army has increased the use of the Cultural Understanding and Language Proficiency program to provide cadets the opportunity to experience other cultures and languages. However, cultural awareness courses or language abilities have remained an option and not a requirement to complete the Reserve Officer Training Corps program. Given the number of officers produced in the Army Reserve Officer Training Corps program, any enhancements that can be made to the Reserve Officer Training Corps program could have long-reaching effects in improving the quality of leadership in the U.S. Army and its performance. This continued need for leader development improvement in the Reserve Officer Training Corps program was expertly stated by mentioned Schulter. Reserve Officer Training Corps must continue to strive for excellence to produce the best officers for the most formidable military force in the world. Every mother, father, sister, and brother expects our servicemen and women to have the best leadership in the world. They expect this of our nation, so that in the moment of life or death, when decisions must be made in an instant, the leader will understand the situation, critically evaluate the possibilities, use good judgment, and execute the decision with confidence. Reserve Officer Training Corps plays a critical role in ensuring national security by supplying the U.S. Army with the majority of commissioned officers. With the importance that this program plays in the leadership of the U.S. Army, constant improvement to leader development programs should be continually sought. Interdisciplinary studies. If the purpose of self-development is to create truly adaptive leaders capable of moving past outdated doctrines and approaches to warfare, their approach to education must be capable of doing the same. The interdisciplinary approach to complex problems can be moved past the traditional assumptions and research structures of individual disciplines. Given the complex operational environments and social problems that modern officers are asked to address, they need the academic tools, technologies, and methods that are capable of identifying solutions. Interdisciplinary approaches provide the means to look for the innovative approaches that cannot be produced in the restrictive environment of individual academic fields. May be best stated by Beagle, an unadaptive learner is an unadaptive leader. Interdisciplinary approaches provide an adaptive approach to learning that can create the adaptive leaders the Army desires. The desire to create leaders that are capable of looking at a problem through the lenses of multiple academic disciplines is not restricted only to the military. There is a current push to integrate more interdisciplinary practices in undergraduate programs. This push to utilize interdisciplinary techniques has been driven by four significant factors: the inherent complexity of nature and society, the desire to explore problems and questions that are not confined to a single discipline, the need to solve societal problems, and the power of new technologies. These factors and their application to leadership studies in the U.S. Army will be examined below. The concepts behind interdisciplinary research and Army innovation are very similar. Where innovation seeks to introduce ideas and techniques outside of the normal operation, interdisciplinary research aims to answer questions that may lie outside of the normal boundaries of a single academic discipline. For example, imagine facing the challenge of trying to determine reasons for and ways to prevent individuals from joining an insurgency. In the normal operations of individuals trained in a single discipline, they generally default in trying to locate the answer in their discipline. As a result, an economist might suggest that poverty was the primary cause of insurgency and, therefore, could be combated by economic improvements. A theologian might suggest that the insurgency is being caused by religious beliefs and could be combated through improving literacy so that individuals can read source literature of their religion. While each discipline might resort to try to correct the problem using their discipline, just like waging a war, the modern Army leader cannot afford to attack problem utilizing a single-pronged approach. The best military strategies are built upon multiple approaches to the same problem. For example, attacking supply lines, support units, and enemy combat units simultaneously. By doing so, if one tactic fails, there are still other approaches that may be successful. The use of an interdisciplinary approach to problem solving is simply applying techniques and theories that have proven effective and waging war to the academic approach to problem solving. With the exception of Army specialty branches, Army officers are not required to have specific majors in their bachelor's degrees. Given the size of the U.S. Army, this organization is most likely the largest collection of interdisciplinary scholars ever assembled. Each officer brings with them the skills of their academic field of study but must also have the ability to work with others of different fields to find solutions to complex problems. The example of battling insurgency demonstrates the need for Army officers to be interdisciplinarians to effectively face problems that are highly complex, multiple discipline, and involve societal problems. Farrington calls upon officers to become multidisciplinary to meet the complexities of the current political and operational needs of the long war. While a multidiscipline approach provides more outcomes and options to Army leaders, interdisciplinary scholarship would create even more options by drawing upon all disciplines and areas outside or between traditional disciplines. Although the Army never uses the term interdisciplinary research when defining leader development, the concept of interdisciplinary studies is present in the definitions of the characteristics of an Army leader. Field Manual 1-0 states that Army leaders have the ability to inspire creative thinking and they are challenging inflexible ways of thinking. The Army Officer Corps, at least in the basic branches, might be the widest collection of interdisciplinary scholars in existence. While an Army officer requires a bachelor's degree for commissioning, there is no special requirement in the basic branches that the academic major matches their assigned military profession. In this way, Army officers often have two distinct academic traditions, both military doctrine and their respective academic field, to draw upon to solve problems. The teamwork between Army officers further expands the different academic disciplines that can be brought together to address any given problem. Thus, the nature of the military is already accepting of an interdisciplinary approach to problems. Therefore, it can be assumed a bachelor's degree program can be established to further advance Army leader development using an interdisciplinary approach. The concept of interdisciplinary research has been difficult to define universally. Many attempts to define interdisciplinary research have been made and continue to be made since the mid-1970s to further define this concept. In many ways, interdisciplinary research is easiest to define in the negative, as what it is not. In the simplest of terms, it is not the type of research conducted in any other single academic field. Gunn, as quoted by Newell, defined interdisciplinary research as simply an academic poaching license. While this negative approach to a definition might be relatively functional among professors, some type of not inserts academic field of study. Approach definition can cause multiple issues among students, graduates, and faculties of interdisciplinary programs. Problems can include difficulty with explaining interdisciplinary programs to non-academics, issues with establishing learning objectives, problems with student morale, troubles with academic community acceptance, and barriers with developing depth and sophistication of programs. Faced with the negative impacts of not having a clear definition of interdisciplinary studies, several definitions of interdisciplinary studies have been examined. Definitions from multiple sources have been examined in an attempt to draw out the commonalities and establish a working definition of interdisciplinary studies. Newell collected and examined the definitions of interdisciplinary studies from Repko, Newell, Roten, Mansiller, Chun, and Klein, Boyks-Mansiller, the Committee on Facilitating Interdisciplinary Research and Committee on Science, Engineering, and Policy of the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, and Institute of Medicine, and Klein and Newell in an attempt to create a common and comprehensive definition. Although the various definitions do have variations to their length and content, there are several common thought processes that are shared among these definitions. Newell discovered that continued research is still needed to further clarify a definition of interdisciplinary studies. Even with a variety of definitions examined, many issues in interdisciplinary studies have yet to be addressed in a definition. Recognizing the continued need for definition development and further research in identifying the exact process of interdisciplinary research, commonalities will be drawn from the definitions above to function as a working definition for the sake of this study. Newell identified 9 commonalities among interdisciplinary studies definitions. 1. An interdisciplinary study has a specific substantive focus. 2. The focus of an interdisciplinary study exceeds the scope of a single perspective. 3. The distinctive characteristic of the focus of an interdisciplinary study is that it is broad or complex. 4. Interdisciplinary studies as a whole are characterized by an identifiable process/mode. 5. Interdisciplinary studies draw explicitly on the disciplines. 6. Disciplines provide insights into the specific substantive focus of an interdisciplinary study. 7. Interdisciplinary study requires integration. 8. The objective of integration is instrumental. 9. The goal of an interdisciplinary study is pragmatic, to solve a problem, resolve an issue, address a topic, answer a question, explain a phenomenon, or create a new product. Although Newell may not have intended for his examination of the commonalities among interdisciplinary studies definitions to be utilized as a working definition of interdisciplinary studies, it actually functions well for this purpose. The problem with structured self-development. In October of 2010, the U.S. Army introduced structured self-development courses intended to improve the education of non-commissioned officers. As of October 2012, structured self-development courses have become a mandatory requirement in the non-commissioned officer education system and now impact a soldier's promotability. According to the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, Non-commissioned officer education system provides non-commissioned officers with progressive and sequential leader, technical and tactical training relevant to the duties, responsibilities and missions they will perform in operational units after graduation. Non-commissioned officer education system requirements include formal professional military education courses such as Basic Leadership Course, Advanced Leadership Course, Senior Leadership Course, and Sergeant Major Course. Structured self-development courses are now required before each formal course. Structured Self-Development 1 is to be completed before Basic Leadership Course. Structured Self-Development 2 is to be completed before Advanced Leadership Course, etc. The problem with structured self-development is that it represents a significant departure from civilian theories of self-directed learning like the one presented by Malcolm Knowles. The addition of structured self-development has further complicated the concept of Army self-development and may have resulted from a misnomer caused by fiscal concerns. As previously noted, the complexity of war is increasing the consumption of training time in teaching technical and tactical skills. Labeling this requirement as self-development may have been a way to require soldiers to complete additional education while preserving limited training budgets. National Guard and Army Reserve soldiers could be denied pay and allowances normally associated with formal education course in the completion of these new educational requirements labeled self-development, as these courses are now completed on their own time. In the new revision of the Leader Development Field Manual 6-22, released in June 2015, structured self-development is defined as mandatory learning modules required to meet specific learning objectives and requirements, while the revised Field Manual 6-22 created a new definition for this type of training. It is not clear why it wouldn't have been better placed within the pillar of education of the Army Leader Development Model. Education being defined as a pillar of Army leader development including, but not limited to, civilian education and professional military education provided by Army Training and Doctrine Command schools. Examining U.S. Army Sergeants Major Academy's website, the mission of the Structured Self-Development Course Manager is responsible for promoting, designing, developing, delivering, and maintaining distributed learning and interactive multimedia instruction products for structured self-development in support of the non-commissioned officer professional development system. Structured self-development engages soldiers cognitively by providing a blended learning environment for enlisted soldiers. Structured self-development provides interactive multimedia instruction course where soldiers can use anytime and anywhere in the world. The structured self-development program helps to prepare soldiers in meeting challenges of the operational environment and assists in developing effective, adaptive, agile, and critical thinking soldiers for the sustainable readiness model. Upon examination of this mission statement, it may be assumed the Army placed this course under the pillar of self-development because of the way the course was presented, distributed learning, and not how this information was to be learned. Given that soldiers that progress through structured self-development are not allowed to choose the subject materials being presented or even how they are to learn the presented materials, leads one to ask where is the self is in these structured self-development courses. Once again we can see the departure of the concept of Army self-development greatly deviating away from established civilian concepts of self-directed learning. We might ask what civilian educational institution might define an online or blended course of learning as self-development while labeling the same course taught in a physical classroom as education? Furthermore, has the concept of a self-paced online learning module been confused with the idea of self-development, implying that self-development is simply the ability to motivate oneself to ensure course completion? The introduction of structured self-development has damaged the already misunderstood concept of Army self-development. While structured self-development might increase the education value in the currently fiscally restrictive environment, it ultimately damages the idea of self-development and does not support soldiers in conducting actual self-directed learning. Until the concept of structured self-development is better defined or shifted into the pillar of education, the Army leader development model as a whole is threatened. Summary. The need for quality Army leadership is ever increasing with the complexities of modern warfare. Army leaders must now address adaptive and innovative enemies while facing rapid changes in technologies and approaches to warfighting. Not only are officers expected to expertly execute military operations, but they are now also being asked to take on many non-traditional military roles. Functions like city planning, business development, and community organizing are challenging officers that may possess no previous experiences or formal instruction in these areas. But all of these challenges have to be borne in addition to those presented by the modern battlefield. As the multitude of tasks asked of Army officer continues to expand, the training time and resources are failing to keep pace. While some adjustments to training courses and procedures are likely to improve leader performance, the bulk of learning for future officers is likely to occur outside the classroom, and much of it will need to be done by the officer him/herself. That is why self-development capacities are so crucial for the modern officer. It is in this incredibly complex and rapidly evolving environment that the domain of self-development is becoming ever more important. But while the need for self-development seems to be ever increasing, the use, value, and understanding of this concept is diminishing. With the demands of the long war significantly straining the operational abilities of units, many leaders abandon self-development practices due to lack of time and lack of perceived value. The concept of self-development presented by the Army manuals is, unfortunately, vague and claims to produce results that may not occur within every self-development technique. With the lack of at least a minimally agreed-upon target list of the key self-development techniques that must be emphasized in training, many leaders do not know how to identify the correct techniques to produce precise results. Many leaders that have attempted self-development have failed to develop in the ways promised by Army self-development theories. Unfortunately, this has led to the large-scale abandonment of the practices that could optimize leaders for the complexities of modern warfare. The Army Reserve Officer Training Corps, having been created in 1916, is failing to produce leaders that are balanced within the Army leader development model. While it is understandable that Reserve Officer Training Corps cadets cannot receive operational experience before completing the program, the Reserve Officer Training Corps program is not providing instruction on self-development practices while cadets progress through the program. This results in graduates of Reserve Officer Training Corps having only received instruction in the institutional domain of the three-domain system. With junior officers taking an increasingly important role in the decentralized execution of missions on the modern battlefield, the U.S. Army is failing to prepare these junior leaders with the tools required to fulfill these roles. This research sought to provide a solid definition of the concept of self-development and a list of self-development techniques that can be utilized to address specific Army leadership dimensions. By producing such a list, it is hoped that the practice of self-development technique might be more readily adopted by Army leaders. By simplifying the selection process of self-development techniques to address specific leader needs, it is assumed that the perceived value of self-development would increase as it would be likely to produce the desired results. The instruction and use of the developed self-development approaches could have a dramatic increase in Army officer performance if they could be adapted for use within the current Army Reserve Officer Training Corps program. While there is a great need for additional research on several other factors influencing the full integration of self-development practices, this research is likely a step in the right direction. Further research on the impact of motivation, individual self-development plan development, and assessment techniques will be needed to develop fully and optimize a comprehensive Army approach to self-development. While the concept of Army self-development may still be in its infancy, the impact and need for such development are readily apparent. This is the end of Chapter 2. Thank you for listening. Please click on the link provided to continue on to Chapter 3, Research Method.